Did you know the atomic bomb on Hiroshima didn't just end World War II? It triggered the arms race that defined the entire Cold War. One city was chosen to make history, Hiroshima. But why that city? Did the United States warn Japan before unleashing the atomic bomb? And if Hiroshima was destroyed in an instant, why didn't Japan surrender right away? Was the bomb on Nagasaki even more powerful? Most people think World War II ended with Hiroshima, but the truth is, it opened the door to a new, terrifying era, the Cold War. If you've ever wondered about the real reasons behind the bombings, you need to hear this story. Why did the US pick Hiroshima to bomb? In the summer of 1945, the United States faced one of the most consequential military decisions in world history, where to unleash the power of the atomic bomb. This decision was not made randomly. Hiroshima, a bustling industrial and military hub in southwestern Japan, was chosen after careful calculation. Hiroshima's geography made it a target of strategic significance. The city was surrounded by mountains, forming a natural bowl that would concentrate the bomb's destructive force. Military planners believed this unique terrain would maximize the psychological impact of the weapon by showing just how devastating the new technology could be. But beyond geography, Hiroshima was a critical center of Japanese military operations. It housed the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army, which commanded defense forces in southern Japan. The city also contained large military stockpiles and factories producing war supplies, from weapons to transport equipment. Unlike Tokyo, which had already been ravaged by firebombing, Hiroshima was relatively untouched. This made it the perfect location to demonstrate the raw, unparalleled power of the atomic bomb. Another factor was visibility. The US wanted to measure and photograph the effects of the blast with scientific precision. For that reason, they required a city with minimal previous damage. Hiroshima fit this requirement perfectly. A medium-sized city with a population of about 350,000 and no significant bombing raids prior to August 1945. Behind the decision was also a psychological motive. US officials hoped that choosing Hiroshima, an important but not the largest Japanese city, would send a chilling message. If such destruction could be inflicted on one city in seconds, Japan's entire homeland could be reduced to ashes unless it surrendered. Thus, Hiroshima became the first target of nuclear warfare, selected for a mixture of military importance, geographic suitability, and symbolic impact. It was not just a city on a map. It was a carefully chosen stage for the most devastating weapon the world had ever seen. Did the US warn Japan about Hiroshima? The question of whether Japan was warned about the atomic bomb has long been debated by historians. The answer is complex. Yes, Japan was warned in general terms, but no, it was not specifically told that Hiroshima would face nuclear annihilation. In late July 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. However, the statement was deliberately vague. It made no mention of the atomic bomb, partly because the weapon was still secret, and partly because American leaders believed that the element of surprise would maximize its shock value. Alongside the Potsdam Declaration, the US had been dropping millions of leaflets across Japanese cities throughout the summer of 1945. These leaflets urged civilians to evacuate urban areas and called on the government to surrender. But again, none of them revealed the true nature of the weapon about to be used. To most Japanese leaders and citizens, utter destruction meant firebombing raids, not a single bomb capable of erasing an entire city. Inside the Japanese government, there was heated debate over how to interpret the Allies' warnings. Many hardline military officials dismissed them as propaganda, while others believed Japan could negotiate better surrender terms through diplomacy. This refusal to take the warnings seriously proved fatal. Thus, while Japan had been cautioned of devastating consequences, Hiroshima itself received no specific, direct warning. The city's people woke on the morning of August 6th unaware that history's most destructive weapon was already en route toward them. And when the bomb fell, the world would soon ask, which was worse, Hiroshima or the second bomb that followed? Which bomb was bigger, Hiroshima or Nagasaki? When comparing the two atomic bombs dropped on Japan, there is often confusion about which was the more powerful weapon. On August 6, 1945, the bomb nicknamed Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. Just 3 days later, on August 9th, the bomb called Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. Little Boy, the Hiroshima bomb, was a uranium-235 device. It weighed about 9,700 pounds and had an explosive yield of roughly 15 kilotons of TNT. Its destructive force leveled much of Hiroshima in seconds, killing tens of thousands instantly. By contrast, Fat Man, the Nagasaki bomb, was a plutonium-239 implosion-type device. It weighed slightly more, around 10,300 pounds, but its explosive yield was far greater, approximately 21 kilotons of TNT. Technically, the Nagasaki bomb was the more powerful weapon. However, the results were not as straightforward as the numbers suggest. Hiroshima's flat terrain and dense urban core meant Little Boy's effects spread evenly across the city, amplifying the devastation. Nagasaki, by contrast, was surrounded by hills and mountains that contained much of the blast. Even though Fat Man was more powerful on paper, the natural geography shielded parts of Nagasaki from the full force of destruction. The comparison between the two bombs reveals a deeper truth. The scale of suffering was not measured solely in kilotons, but in the human impact. Both weapons introduced the world to a new age of warfare, where a single device could obliterate a city and alter the course of history. As the mushroom clouds rose, military planners in Washington expected Japan to surrender after Hiroshima. Yet, despite the devastation, Japan's leaders hesitated. And so came the critical question. Why did Japan not surrender after Hiroshima? Why did Japan not surrender after Hiroshima? On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds. Tens of thousands perished instantly, and the survivors faced a nightmare of burns, radiation, and collapsing infrastructure. Yet, despite this overwhelming devastation, Japan did not immediately surrender. To understand why, one must look inside the mindset of the Japanese government and military in those final days of World War II. Japan in 1945 was a nation divided. On one side stood the Peace Party, led by figures who recognized the futility of continuing the war. On the other stood the military hardliners, determined to fight to the very end, regardless of the cost. For these leaders, surrender was unthinkable, an unbearable humiliation to the emperor and a betrayal of the Bushido Code, which valued honor and sacrifice above life itself. The full scale of Hiroshima's destruction was not immediately understood in Tokyo. Communications with the city were cut off, and early reports were vague. Many military officials believed it was simply another conventional bombing raid. Others dismissed the Americans' claim of a new superweapon as propaganda designed to break Japanese morale. Even when the reality of Hiroshima's annihilation became clear, Japan's Supreme War Council, often referred to as the Big Six, remained deadlocked. Peace advocates urged acceptance of the Allies' terms laid out in the Potsdam Declaration. Hardliners insisted on conditions, such as preserving the emperor's authority and retaining some measure of sovereignty. The United States, however, demanded unconditional surrender. Cultural and ideological factors also played a role. The Japanese military had indoctrinated its people to view surrender as worse than death. Civilians were trained to resist an invasion with bamboo spears if necessary. Leaders clung to the hope that if Japan fought on long enough, it could negotiate more favorable terms, or even that the Soviet Union might mediate a peace agreement. Thus, even after Hiroshima was obliterated, Japan did not yield. The nation stood paralyzed between those seeking peace and those demanding defiance, unable to act decisively. But only 3 days later, another bomb would fall, this time on Nagasaki, and the world would watch to see if Japan's resistance could withstand a second act of nuclear devastation. Did World War II end after Hiroshima? When the Enola Gay released the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the world changed forever. Yet, despite the massive destruction, tens of thousands killed instantly, and much of the city reduced to ruins, Japan did not surrender immediately. The question remains, did World War II end after Hiroshima? The answer is more complicated than many assume. At first, Japanese leaders were stunned, but not united in their response. Some members of the military believed the United States had only one bomb and that Japan could still continue the fight. Others argued that surrender was inevitable. The emperor himself remained largely silent in those early hours, waiting to see how events unfolded. Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. officials were prepared for this hesitation. President Harry Truman had authorized the use of a second bomb if Japan refused to yield. The world held its breath as days passed with no Japanese surrender. On August 9, 1945, a second bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki. The destruction was catastrophic once again. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Japanese-held territories in Manchuria. Now Japan faced annihilation not from one, but two superpowers. It was only after these combined blows, the devastation of two cities and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war, that Emperor Hirohito made an unprecedented decision. On August 15, 1945, he addressed the nation directly, announcing Japan's surrender. For the first time in history, his people heard his voice broadcast over the radio. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, had finally come to an end. But the end of the war was also the beginning of something else. The use of the atomic bomb did more than stop World War II. It opened a new age of fear, rivalry, and power struggles. The world was no longer just at peace. It was stepping into the Cold War. How did Hiroshima lead to the Cold War? The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than end the Second World War. They reshaped the global balance of power and set the stage for decades of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The world had never seen weapons capable of such instantaneous, total destruction, and the sudden emergence of American nuclear supremacy created a new and dangerous rivalry. At the moment Hiroshima fell, the Soviet Union had not yet declared war on Japan, and Joseph Stalin was still negotiating with the Allies over the post-war order in Europe. The United States, by deploying the bomb without fully informing the Soviets, sent a powerful signal. America now possessed unprecedented military power, capable of deciding the outcome of wars on its own terms. Stalin perceived this as a deliberate threat, a demonstration of dominance that excluded the Soviet Union from the Pacific theater and from having any real influence over Japan's post-war settlement. This sense of exclusion deepened existing suspicions. Wartime cooperation between the United States and the USSR had always been uneasy, characterized by mutual distrust despite a shared goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Hiroshima crystallized these tensions into a clear divide. Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb, without consultation, was interpreted by Stalin as a hostile act, accelerating his distrust of the West and his determination to secure Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The bombings also marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race. Both powers now understood that the future of warfare and global dominance was tied to atomic capability. The United States' demonstration of power in Hiroshima and Nagasaki created a technological and psychological benchmark. The Soviets, alarmed by this sudden imbalance, prioritized their own nuclear program, determined not to be left defenseless in a world dominated by a single superpower. In essence, Hiroshima was not merely the end of one war, it became the opening act of another. The display of nuclear destruction shattered any illusions of a post-war world shared equally between allies. It cemented the United States' position as the preeminent power and ignited an era of strategic rivalry, distrust, and ideological competition that would define the Cold War. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but it had also begun a new, invisible war. A contest not fought with armies, but with espionage, propaganda, and the looming threat of annihilation. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union, once a superpower rivaling the United States, faced a perfect storm of economic, political, and social pressures that ultimately led to its collapse. The reasons were multifaceted, combining systemic weaknesses with external pressures that the USSR could no longer withstand. At the heart of the Soviet decline was its centralized command economy. Designed for rapid industrialization and military output, it was ill-equipped to meet the needs of a modern society. Factories churned out military hardware at the expense of consumer goods, leaving ordinary citizens with shortages, low-quality products, and declining living standards. The inefficiency of this system created widespread discontent and eroded confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy effectively. Meanwhile, the arms race with the United States placed an enormous financial strain on the Soviet state. To keep pace with American technological and nuclear advancements, the USSR poured vast resources into defense spending. The war in Afghanistan further drained the economy and the military, becoming a costly quagmire that mirrored the United States' own experience in Vietnam decades earlier. Political and social pressures compounded the economic crisis. By the 1980s, popular dissatisfaction was growing across the Soviet Union, fueled by lack of political freedoms, declining quality of life, and frustration with the rigid communist system. In addition, the catastrophic Chernobyl disaster of 1986 revealed governmental incompetence and further shattered public trust. The costs of containment and cleanup were staggering, and the incident exposed systemic weaknesses that could no longer be concealed. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were intended to modernize the Soviet Union, yet they unintentionally accelerated its unraveling. Glasnost encouraged public criticism of the government, revealing decades of mismanagement and corruption. Perestroika attempted to restructure the economy, but it destabilized production and distribution, deepening shortages and economic uncertainty. International pressure also played a decisive role. U.S. President Ronald Reagan's policies, including strategic defense initiatives and economic measures such as lowering global oil prices, intensified the financial strain on the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe removed key allies and undermined Moscow's geopolitical influence, signaling that the Soviet model was failing abroad as well as at home. In the end, the Soviet Union could not sustain its economic, military, and political burdens. By 1991, the Union of Republics dissolved, leaving 15 independent nations in its place. The Cold War, a decades-long standoff between the superpowers, concluded not with a decisive battle, but with the quiet disintegration of the USSR, exposing the limits of its ideology and centralized control. Who is the winner of the Cold War? By the early 1990s, the world witnessed the dramatic conclusion of a geopolitical struggle that had lasted nearly half a century. The Cold War, defined by ideological rivalry, nuclear brinkmanship, and proxy conflicts, came to an unmistakable end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this historic moment, the United States emerged as the clear victor, not through a single decisive battle, but through a combination of sustained economic, ideological, and strategic pressure. Economically, the United States had steadily leveraged its market-driven system and technological innovation to outpace the Soviet command economy. The arms race, particularly the nuclear and space programs, had drained Soviet resources while American industry and consumer economies continued to grow. Policies such as President Reagan's defense buildup and strategic initiatives, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, exacerbated the financial strain on the USSR, further highlighting the disparity between the two superpowers. Ideologically, the Cold War demonstrated the resilience and appeal of democratic capitalism. The Soviet model, centered on centralized planning and restricted freedoms, failed to deliver economic prosperity or political satisfaction to its citizens. By contrast, Western nations promoted open markets, individual liberties, and global influence, offering a tangible contrast that eroded confidence in the Soviet system both domestically and across Eastern Europe. Politically, internal reforms within the USSR unintentionally accelerated its disintegration. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed to modernize the Soviet system but exposed its systemic weaknesses. Coupled with nationalist movements and anti-communist revolts throughout Eastern Europe, the reforms set in motion a cascade that the Soviet leadership could not control. By December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, leaving the United States as the undisputed global superpower. The symbolic markers of this victory were unmistakable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991, and the emergence of the United States as the sole arbiter of international security and economic order. While the Cold War had never been a conventional war with a singular battlefield, the outcome was clear. The American model of governance and economy had prevailed, and the era of bipolar global tension had ended. Yet, as the world celebrated this conclusion, new questions loomed on the horizon. Questions about emerging powers, shifting alliances, and the lessons the United States would carry into a post-Cold War world. Victory was evident, but the story of global influence was far from over. How did the Cold War end? By the late 1980s, the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between two superpowers, was showing clear signs of unraveling. The Soviet Union, once a formidable rival to the United States, was straining under economic, political, and social pressures that had been mounting for decades. At the forefront of these changes was Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who assumed power in 1985. Recognizing the systemic inefficiencies of the command economy, he introduced two transformative policies: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allowed for greater transparency in government and freedom of expression, revealing the depth of corruption and inefficiency that had long plagued the Soviet system. Perestroika sought to modernize the economy, decentralize planning, and encourage limited market reforms. While intended to strengthen the USSR, these reforms instead accelerated political instability, emboldening independence movements within the Soviet republics and stirring public discontent. Externally, the Soviet Union faced mounting pressure from the United States. President Ronald Reagan's military buildup and strategic policies, including the deployment of missiles in Europe and aggressive economic maneuvers such as influencing oil prices, further strained the Soviet economy. The war in Afghanistan had already drained resources and morale, leaving the USSR overextended and vulnerable. In Eastern Europe, long-suppressed revolts erupted as citizens demanded democratic reforms. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, symbolizing the collapse of Soviet control across the region. Communist governments across the Eastern Bloc quickly dissolved, leaving Moscow with diminished influence. The final internal shock came in August 1991, when hardline communist leaders attempted a coup against Gorbachev. The coup failed, but it revealed the fragility of Soviet authority. Within months, the USSR formally disintegrated into 15 independent republics. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, marking the definitive end of the Soviet Union, and with it, the Cold War itself. The United States emerged as the lone superpower, with no rival of comparable economic or military strength. The Cold War, which had defined global geopolitics for nearly half a century, concluded not with a single battle, but through a series of political, economic, and social pressures that made confrontation obsolete. Yet the story did not end entirely. While the original Cold War was over, the geopolitical landscape that emerged left new tensions and rivalries in its wake, laying the foundation for what some analysts now call a new Cold War. Is the Cold War still going on today? The Cold War, a decades-long geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, officially ended with the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the conclusion of a global conflict defined not by direct military battles between superpowers, but by ideological rivalry, nuclear brinkmanship, and competing spheres of influence. Yet while the original Cold War ended, historians and analysts increasingly debate whether a new form of this rivalry has emerged in the 21st century. Tensions between the United States and countries, such as China and a resurgent Russia, suggest a world where the dynamics of competition, technological, economic, and military, resemble aspects of the Cold War, albeit under very different circumstances. The original conflict was bipolar, centered on a clear ideological divide: capitalist democracy versus communist authoritarianism. Today's global landscape is multipolar, with economic interdependence and advanced technology playing central roles. Modern Cold War tensions manifest in cyber warfare, trade disputes, and regional conflicts, rather than the direct nuclear standoff that defined the mid-20th century. The end of the original Cold War also reshaped international institutions. Former Soviet states established independent governments, and Eastern Europe transitioned toward market economies and democratic structures. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991 symbolized the triumph of the United States' vision of global liberal democracy, but also highlighted the fragility of political systems built under authoritarian rule. Today, policymakers study the Cold War not as a closed chapter, but as a source of lessons for managing global rivalries. The original struggle demonstrates the importance of strategic alliances, economic resilience, and technological innovation in preventing escalation. While the ideological clash that fueled the 20th century Cold War is gone, the world remains vigilant, aware that the shadows of the past still influence contemporary geopolitics. The question lingers: can history avoid repeating itself, or is a new era of superpower rivalry inevitable?